Hello everyone, and welcome to This Nintendo Life episode 283. It's time for the alarm bells to start ringing. Neenor down the street. There's things happening. People are talking about a video game console that might exist. And no, it's not the sequel to the Nintendo Switch. It's the PlayStation 5 Pro, Bally. We could just talk about that instead. No, we just been talking about that on a separate thing for our Patreon. But Bally, there's some news that people have been thinking is real. Apparently, there's some successors to the Switch is happening, and there's some leaks about it. And some people think it's real, and some people are not sure about whether it's real or not. Now, where, Bally, do you fall?
And then there are fence sitters like MBZ.
I'm not a fence sitter. I'm team fake all the way. Nothing's real. I don't believe fucking anything. If it doesn't have a projector or a stupid thing like a laser beam in it, it's not a real Nintendo product. All right.
Yes.
So yeah, that's been going around. There's been rumors and renders out there on the internet. Bally, how are you feeling about this stuff? Do you believe in the situation that we find ourselves in?
I think it's less like this specific leak, which I agree could be fake or real, and it's more that there's like multiple people like Jeff Grubb, Andy Robinson, who have like been hearing things from people who have seen things but don't have the renders, as it were, saying, oh yeah, it looks like this and it's going to have this, and they obviously all match this render. But I think the fact that there are people in factories aware of what this thing looks like means that surely Nintendo will suggest something soon, and that it will look, if it doesn't look identical to this leak, because of all the corroboration around what these journalists have been saying, if it doesn't look like this leak, it will still look incredibly similar to this leak. And that, I think that's what's exciting, and that's what I believe in, even if I don't necessarily think this specific leak is true. Where I think there was one user on Reddit who this was posted in our Discord, saying how this person works in a Chinese factory and is famous for mocking up things and sometimes fakes them, sometimes doesn't, or something. So
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's like I said,
and that was Reddit. No other podcast or outlet has said that. That was just this one person on Reddit. So.
Right, exactly. So who knows? I mean, there's a lot of smoke around it. Obviously, it feels like we're in a point in time when Nintendo are moving into production of this, and so I believe that's the case, because you have to do that if you're going to launch a thing relatively soon, which would, I think, indicate, if it's being put into production now, it's sooner rather than later next year. Maybe it is an April, March release, and a lot of people, I think, prior to this leak coming out, Chris Dring on Twitter was being like, oh, I've been hearing rumbles about September and a Nintendo announcement or something, and I think it's weird because we follow Nintendo very closely, and they tend to do this thing where if they have a relevant product coming out that they're marketing, they're not going to do anything until they are clear of that. And we know that The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom launches on September 26th. So, relevant product that they are marketing right now, and they want everybody to be focused on that. It doesn't make sense for them to swerve and say, hey, by the way, here's a Nintendo Switch successor, right before, undercutting their new thing that's coming. And so I think that it's more likely it's going to happen after that releases, because otherwise it feels like they're undercutting their own thing, and they want it to flourish and do well.
You think end of September or October?
I think probably October at this point, if it is going to happen.
Because they've had a direct every single September since the launch of the Switch. And I think this might be the first September they don't have a direct. And it'll be for the very reason, as you say, to have, whatever it is. Let's say I think there's been rumors about them filming a trailer as well, like actors and shit being involved in that. There's rumors about that. So it sounds like it's going to be a trailer. And yeah, I think you're right. October, we actually see this thing.
Yeah, I wonder if it's going to be the same rollout as before with the same setup. I mean, it worked so well previously. They probably want to repeat history and do a similar thing. And I don't know, I think there's a lot to be thought about with this, right? Because in some senses, it feels very un-Nintendo to just do another thing that's the same as the previous thing. It's like, oh, it's a slightly bigger version of that thing, and it still uses the same Joy-Con kind of idea. Obviously, technology is different. But it's just like, oh, it's the bigger one, and it's more powerful. And I'm like, that's not Nintendo. That's not what they do. Like, it feels wrong.
The rumors are it's the power between the Xbox Series S and the PS 5.
Right. And I'm like, that doesn't feel right to me. But then when you think about it, right, you think about Nintendo as a company now and who's in charge now and how they have changed, and they're probably looking at it and they're thinking, okay, well, you know, we've done this dance before where we've moved from one generation to the next and we've flopped after a super success, right? We've had big successes and then we just go downhill after that. And they're probably thinking, how do we not do that again, right? How do we make sure that we capitalize on the success of our previous system? And what do we do to do that? And so I think it has led to some very non-Nintendo-like decision-making. And likely that's probably why we're going to be in this situation, is that they're kind of fed up with messing it up every time after a generation. And we're also like in the most precarious point within games where like you can't lose an audience now. Because if you do, then... you know, like people talked about with the Xbox, you know, they lost the worst generation with the digital libraries. If you do that with the Switch and you don't keep everyone's digital library, your entire audience is going to run away. Like obviously, like there's so many more casual people now who use phones and have these ecosystems that they work within, and their understanding of the way the world works is I carry everything over to the next thing that I buy because that's how the world works. And Nintendo previously were like, no, we don't do that. But that was in an era before this was so, regular thing.
And it was them going from Wii U that had sold 13 million units to Switch, where I think they were prepared to...
Well, even from the Wii, you know, I think even that era when the iPhone still was bubbling to the surface, you know, in the Wii era, you couldn't carry your virtual console games over to the Wii U. Well, actually, you technically could, but you had to pay a price for it.
There was a whole Pikmin thing.
It was a bit of a mess.
And then you would pay a little premium for each game. But you did get the value of now you can like play it on a gamepad, and like I remember playing Super Mario World on a plane with my Wii U plugged in to the plane. Like, I think it was not a good value thing to do and should have been more seamless, but it existed at least.
It existed, but it wasn't the same as like with PS3 to PS4, where I opened my PS4 and I was like, you just download all these PS3 games, and same thing with PS5. I opened my PS5 and it's like, oh, I have all these PS4 games, right? I think that has to be something they do inevitably. And so, you know, are we looking at a safer, more boring, one could say, generation? Maybe. And maybe, you know, in many ways, I think that's probably the right thing for them to do at this juncture in time.
I think they'll be planning that, you know, this will not sell as many units as the Switch if they come anywhere near, or even if they get 3/4 of the way, let's even say 2/3 of the way, they'll be delighted, because I think the thing that has changed from their history is that they're following their most successful console of all time. Like that's the thing that's different. Like you could argue that the other console sales, whether it's GameCube, N64, whatever, forced the change, and this doesn't force the change. And I guess Wii to Wii use a weird one, but that obviously flopped. But I think this time they're like, it worked. And not only did it work selling systems, it worked selling software. And I think, like you say, there are now big fan bases for a bunch of, let's say, 10 to 15, mainly first-party games that will almost all have sequels on the Switch too, that audiences will buy those games, and we will still get 10, 15, 20 million sellers, whether it's Luigi's Mansion 3, the next 3D Zelda, 3D Mario, Metroid Prime. Well, we haven't had Metroid Prime yet on Switch as a bad example, but my point is, like, there's a lot more software sales and software fans for Switch 2 than there were going into the Switch.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't know. I think here's the thing that annoys me the most about those renders. The left Joy-Con still has fucking buttons split up. For fuck's sake. Why? Why would you do that? Why would you keep... I mean, I get
It's not a D-pad, you mean?
It's not a fucking D-pad. And I get... Obviously, if they're going to do the Joy-Con thing again, and it's not like, you know, just a full piece of plastic all stuck together.
I think the size is quite exciting. That thing looks the similar size to the Steam Deck, right?
I think it's bigger in terms of bigger, I think actual size. So there was a YouTube channel actually who did 3D printed. I think it's a Chinese YouTube channel, and she 3D printed what the size would be, and putting it next to the current Switch, it's actually like, it sounds like, oh, it's 1 inch more, but when you do that diagonally, it fucking makes it way bigger than the original, and it feels like, oh my god, it's almost a tablet at that point in time, which is crazy.
My view is, if it doesn't fit in your pocket, it's going to go into a rucksack, and if it's going into a rucksack, that thing can be as big as it bloody well wants, as long as it fits in my rucksack. That's kind of like, because the second you're past pocket size, like, I don't know, a 3DS or whatever, I don't care about the size. I just want it as big as possible. Like, I don't need it to be small and lean and whatever. Let's go big and light, hopefully.
Yeah, I think lightweight is definitely an important factor, especially when you're holding that thing for long periods of time. You know, I've been playing a lot of Steam Deck, and I think it's heavy. It definitely weighs down.
I prop it on a cushion on my crotch every time.
Yeah, you kind of have to, because otherwise you're going to get tired, you know?
Yeah, I also don't want to fry my balls off, but yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
2 for 1.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I don't know. I do and I don't believe these. Like, I do believe that Nintendo are going to do something far more traditional. I feel like there has to be something up, though. There has to be some weird shit they're going to do. Like, it's just not Nintendo if they don't have a weird thing with this console.
Is it weird enough to just keep the motion control and the Joy-Cons, and then they're used for, you know, Ring Fit Adventure style games? Is that enough of a weird thing to do, or you think there's a level beyond that?
That's not weird enough. No, that's just doing the same as you did before, so it's not weird at all. In fact, that's regular. I feel like there has to be something. There has to, the foot hasn't dropped, the shoe hasn't dropped yet on the weird thing, but I feel like there has to be one. And if there is no weird thing, I'm a little bit sad. I've got to be honest. I will be a little bit sad if there is no weird thing, because as much as I want Nintendo to, you know, just do the same thing that they should have done, which is make a better Switch, and that's probably what they're going to do. You know, there's an era of Nintendo that I yearn for, which is being a little bit weird.
But what if the eShop has music? What if they actually do backgrounds and themes and
well then, you know, I can forgive them. I can forgive them in that case.
An activity log, like, sure. I think that's the thing I want to return. Like, the Switch has absolutely nothing.
Yeah, zero personality, right? I think that's kind of thing, because I do think that's the thing, right? Personality is really what I'm getting at here, and it doesn't have to be a weird gimmick, but it has to be personality of some kind, and not the kind of sterile, cold interface that the Switch has had for many years. So,
but we shall see. I mean, we are recording on Saturday, September 21st. This episode comes out Monday, the 23rd of September. Like you said, Zelda comes out on the 26th, and probably stuff will happen after Zelda, but you never know. Stuff might happen before Zelda. That would be a curveball. With the curse of TNL, they will drop their trailer on Monday or Tuesday. Like, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's going to come out the day after we release the next episode. So keep your eyes drawn, peeled. That's it. That's the one. Why did they say peeled? It's such a weird phrase, you know.
Peeling the eyelid off your eye. I don't know.
I guess when I think of peeling, you know, I think of using a peeler, you know, and then when I hear eyes peeled, it's just like scraping skin off.
Yep.
Some fucking weird shit going on there with language, but hey, that's how it works. Anyway, hello. This is a Nintendo video game podcast show, and I'm here to talk about video games on a podcast. Bally, what are you here to talk about? What are people going to hear us talk about on today's show? For
the first segment, we're going to talk about the games that we have been playing, and for the second segment, we're going to cover a few emails.
Yes, indeed. Let's do it. So, video games have been releasing and coming out, and we have some new ones to talk about. And first up, Bally, is a game that I remember, I think 2 years ago, I was watching stuff at E3, I was watching Devolver's press conference, and a trailer played for this game. And I was watching it, I was like, oh, this is a beautiful art style. And then, like, halfway through the trailer, this thing happened where it went from 2D to 3D and it jumped off the page. I was like, oh my god, this thing looks very cool and amazing, and it's super cool. And so what I did is I messaged you on WhatsApp, and I was like, don't look at anything, just watch this trailer.
Yes.
And to just give you the same surprise that I had, because I knew you weren't going to watch the Devolver thing. I think we were both very excited for this video game called The Plucky Squire.
Plucky Squire.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, on that trailer, how, like you say, MZ, you always have to have a marketing beat. What if they'd not marketed the 3D and people played this game and then the 3D happened mid-game and you're like, wow, that's cool. But anyway, I'm playing The Plucky Squire. I'm on chapter 6, and I think there's 10 chapters, and it's a fairly short game. I think I'm maybe like 4 or 5 hours in, and it's a maybe, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 hour kind of game. It's fun so far. It's always hard to follow an all-time favorite game like Astrobot when you play the next game, because it's impossible to not. We always compare games on this show, and it's hard not to be like, oh wow, that feeling and energy I felt for Astro can Plucky Squire get anywhere near it? And it's nowhere near that level of excitement for sure. But it is fun. I think where I'm struggling is I think I'm turning into UMBZ. It's an incredibly slow paced game. And I think that's probably the main reason I haven't beaten it by now, because
Right, yeah.
it's just not I don't find it a very Moorish game to play. I'm not like, I have to see the next story beat, I have to see the next area, I have to see the next thing. I don't think the writing is that interesting. I don't think the story is particularly unique or interesting. The world feels so sort of cutesy fantasy, but in kind of a generic way. Like, it's still a beautiful world and all this, but it's just that kind of that need to find out what happens next in this game. It always feels so minimal. And at its core, it is a Zelda game. It's a very basic Zelda game. And on top of that, the input kind of feels a little bit sluggish. I don't know how to describe it, but when you're playing a game like Mini Shoot Adventures, like, you just feel when you're moving and pressing the triggers to shoot your guns, like, it just feels so instant. The sword swings and the movement almost feels like there's this ever so slight input lag. I've not heard anyone else have this criticism. I don't know if you have.
I did hear a few people say that, actually. Yeah, I've heard a little bit of chatter about it.
I'm playing it on Steam Deck. I don't know if that's having any effect, but it's like this slight delay, and like, the combat is not that high intensity, and you can play it just fine with the slight lag, but you want Zelda games and that swooshing of the sword to feel as snappy and finite as possible. And I'm just not feeling that in that way. I think the popping out of the page mechanic is very, very cool, but then the whole story is more or less so far at least, is taking place inside the book, and then something will happen within the plot that pushes you out the book, and then you'll come back into the book, and then something else will happen. Like, oh, you need to go and get this bow and arrow, for example, and then you go on like this almost mini kind of little adventure jot around the desk that you're on to get the thing, and then you come back, and it's cool, but the actual exploration of the 3D world is incredibly rudimentary. Like, it's not that in depth. It's incredibly visually stunning, but it's that feeling of like, right, we know from the trailer this game is visually stunning and it's so creative, the idea of the 3D world and the 2D world and the switching between the two, and they do deliver on that, but everything else that you can't see doesn't feel as top tier. For example, like, Cuphead came out 7 years ago. When we think about Cuphead now, yes, visually that game is incredible, but alongside its visuals, we remember it's the way that game plays and its mechanics, and the two, I would argue, are as important as each other. Right. With the Plucky Squire, the mechanics just feel so sluggish and lacking and uninteresting in comparison to the visuals and the fundamental pitch of the trailer. And I'm making very large sweeping statements. I've not seen the final kind of third half of the game. Right. But so far, it's just like, this is fun. This is really charming. This is cool. But I'm not, even with a game with this cool new mechanic, I feel like I'm not seeing anything very new. And I don't know. It's tricky because the game is so nicely crafted and the animation is top notch. Mainly the 2D animation. I think the 3D animation is fine. But yeah, it's very rudimentary kind of Zelda design, and there's little towns with little fetch quests, and there's some nice mechanics where you're popping out the page to go and get a thing, and then you come back, and then you're tilting the page to do these things, and then there's kind of like a very light Baba Is You mechanic where you're moving words around to affect the environment, but it's all very plodding, like, and the character movement's very slow, and the writing is not, it all just comes together into this weird, like, this is cool. I think I'd really love Bally Jr. to try this game one day.
Sure,
like,
yeah.
I think it's a really good kind of my first Zelda. But as someone who's played a lot of Zelda and Echoes of Wisdom is around the corner, with all these insane mechanics that just look incredible. This game just feels very rudimentary in comparison, and I can definitely see where people's criticisms come from. Like I'm not. I like it a lot. I'm not. It's not a truly special game for me at all. It's a very good game. But that's predominantly because of its visuals and that 2D to 3D mechanic, and it's not to do with the writing, the characters, the story, the world, like all these things that I need all of that in a Zelda game. Or even if I don't have that, I need like a really snappy combat system or something. And this game doesn't have that either. It's got the interesting mechanic of the 2D to 3D, and it's visually very impressive, both in the 3D world and mainly the 2D animation and drawing. But it just feels a bit lacking in all these other areas that I find quite hard to stomach.
Yeah, so as you can probably tell, I have not picked this game up yet, and part of it was a lot of people whose opinion I trust and respect kind of bouncing off this game in that similar way, and so I heard a lot of stuff about it's very plodding, it's got a story that has a lot of dialogue that is very meaningless and doesn't really do much, and it feels very simple in terms of what you actually have to do. There's not a lot of thought in terms of the puzzle solving, and I've heard a lot of people say the kind of thing that I levied criticisms at like Planet of Lana for, which is you see exactly what you have to do in about 3 seconds and then it takes you 5 minutes to do it, which
I think those puzzles are way more difficult than this game, by the way.
Okay, yeah, but I mean just in terms of like, yeah,
it's
I don't know.
Puzzles,
I don't know how laborious it is to be like, oh, I know exactly what I have to do here. Now it's a case of me slowly walking over.
Yep, there's a lot of that in this game for sure.
Right,
definitely.
Right. Which makes me, So my plan was, I should be getting a free code for PlayStation Plus through, and so my plan was like use that and play Plucky Squire, and that's how I was going to experience it. I'm almost hearing your thoughts on it now and like everything you've said about it. I don't know whether it's even worth my time to play this game this year, because a lot of things you're saying are things that for me within games, and my taste very well, feels like I would be quite annoyed by and bounce off it and not want to partake in it, which is a shame because I do think the game looks absolutely gorgeous. Like you said, the art style is stunning, and like I really love the creativity that it inspires in terms of like, oh, we're going to, flip the book in different directions and do these different things. But it feels like on a pure gameplay level, it's almost talking down to the audience. Like it doesn't trust you with stuff. I heard a few people say like, it does the Atreus thing from God of War.
Oh my God, does it?
Okay. Oh, that's wow. That's a big reaction to that. Because you know how much I railed against that in God of War and how it annoys me.
It's like Planet of Lana, like you were saying, but then they're like, rather than you saying, oh, I now know what I need to do with this puzzle, they tell you what to do.
God.
But then it still takes a few minutes to go and get the thing, to come back on the page, to move the thing, to get the... It's like, oh my God.
But it sounds like in this case, not only do they tell you, but also you probably could have figured it out in 2 seconds as well.
Yeah, because the book is... Every area of the 2D world is fitted to the page, and most puzzles are within the one page. Now there's a bunch of puzzles I'm getting to where you're required to flip page, bring a thing back to another page,
right.
In and of itself that's kind of laborious, but my point is like, it's not a big expansive Zelda world. It's a very linear game,
yes,
and there's no exploration, the towns are very small, there's like a couple of fetch quests to do in there over. It is really like baby's first Zelda, and that's fine, I guess. But maybe I'm just not the audience in some ways. But it's, I don't know. It still doesn't. There's still like quirks about it that don't feel very Bally Junior friendly, or he'd be a bit like, why is that happening or whatever. And like there are kind of like mini games in between, like with unique boss fights, like you get this bow and arrow like I was saying, and then you're like shooting, and that's a different thing. Everyone's seen the kind of punch out style thing at the start, and mechanically those games just feel very dry, like really, like, I don't know, worse than the, let's say, the worst mini games of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth in kind of the most rudimentary mini games in that, like the shooting section of what's that one at
the beach,
Costa
that
del
kind of
Sol,
area. Yeah.
It feels like worse than that, and it's like, wow, this is I don't know. This just doesn't. It looks pretty, like I said, but it's not any of those other things. And yeah, it's a shame.
It's really interesting to hear your reaction to this, because I definitely associate you as someone who, when it comes down to it, if the game is charming enough, if it has enough of that kind of appeal aesthetically, you can...
But I need the story, or it makes me realize that I actually do need the story or the mechanics, and this game isn't strong in either of those. It's just the visuals, because Planet of Lana is a great example where we kind of disagree on how much we like that game, and for me, the story was pretty good. The visuals in the world were stunning, I guess, like this game. But then the beat to beat of what I was doing in the game, I really enjoyed compared to this game. Like this game, I play 20 minutes, and it feels like I've been playing for, like, I don't know, how do I explain this? I feel like I've been playing a really long time, and I look at the watch and I've been playing 10 minutes. I'm like, really? Like this doesn't feel fun. Like I'm just not.
That's the thing we talk about, like with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, where you do a gauntlet of fights, and because it's so intense, it feels like, oh my god, I've been doing this for like 2 hours. When in actuality, it's only been like 40 minutes or whatever. And I think it's a different thing in this case, where it's so plodding and it's so slow that you're like, I must have been playing for an hour, and you're like, oh, it's been 15 minutes. And that does not sound great, generally speaking.
It's what I come back to a lot on this show, is the reason I sound so critical is that because of that trailer and the internet.
Expectations were so high, right?
The expectations were sky high for this game. And many reviewers, it did live up to expectations for sure. But I think Cuphead is a fantastic example where, whether it's a gimmick or an art style or a vague combination of both, which I guess the kind of 2D to 3D thing is, games and indie games, especially in 2024, need to be doing far more to be top tier indie games. And this had the potential to be top tier, and it is very much not top tier. And I think, like I said, Cuphead is top tier because of its mechanics, not because of its visuals. The visuals are the selling point to get you there. The mechanics keep you there, and this game just doesn't have the thing.
If Cuphead hadn't been fun to play, we wouldn't remember it, right?
Exactly.
Like it wouldn't have stood the test of time.
And this game will not stand the test of time.
That's a shame.
Definitely cannot see it doing that. But aren't they a very new studio? Wasn't it one guy spun out, and like, so to expect them to put together a very mechanically solid, exciting, unusual 2D Zelda game is, I think, high expectations. But
well, it's really interesting, right? So both, the two leads on the project, James Turner is one of them. I think Bids is the other guy's name. So they both kind of came up in the UK games industry. James Turner obviously went on to work on the Pokemon series, was the lead artist, maybe he was the lead artist on Sword and Shield. He definitely did a lot of art on that project. And I'm not sure what the other lead had done, but they had worked on some projects in the past, and they came together to create this. And a really interesting comment I heard from somebody was, like, you can really tell that this is someone who worked on the Pokemon series and made a game that, like, in terms of modern Pokemon games, I think one of the frustrations people have with them is that they kind of talk down to the player. They don't have interesting or involved stories, and they are, their games are essentially still for kids, Pokemon games. I think what they've lost sight of, a lot of it, is like the enjoyment and the friction that can come from kids, like, just, having troubles, like in Mount Moon, where you have to use Flash and you don't have it, and you're bombing around in the dark. And we all did that when we were younger, and we have good memories, and we all got through it in the end. And it's I think, like, everything has become so frictionless now in Pokemon that you don't even have to really think or try or do anything. And simultaneously, it's a game where story is, by its nature, not a priority, and so it is de-emphasized and is the most generic, like, kind of, uninteresting thing.
Yeah, I mean, I do not mind frictionless narrative driven games, like, but when the narrative is so nondescript, I need the frictions, I need the excitement somewhere else, whether it's mechanic, like Mini Shoot Adventures, like that game's not got much of a story, but it's just mechanically this insanely strong game. Visually, the art style is very nice, but it's nothing like the level of Plucky Squire or even like Planet of Lana or something. But that game is still head and shoulders above all these games we're talking about. It's up there with Cuphead in kind of terms of just an awesome game that does what it says on the tin in a way that is so powerful. But then a game like Open Roads that I played earlier this year, very plodding, but I enjoyed the narrative because I went in expecting quite a plodding kind of slow narrative over, I don't know, 3 hours.
That was the sell of it in a way,
and
right?
I enjoyed it. It wasn't anything special, but
at least you had a narrative that felt like it was going somewhere, and there was interest and there was intrigue there. Whereas I think with a game like this, it sounds like it's very fairy tale. It's very storybook.
fairy tale, very like Bally Junior level of fairy tale for like a lot of it. And here's this character who's just from this world, and you need to be interested in them because they're quirky and like. But what's their backstory? Why is it? I don't know. It's just
it's very surface level. It sounds like very much like trying to use its charm to work in its favor.
For sure.
But it sounds like with a story that isn't very engaging and plotting dialogue, and then mechanics that are there's how do you feel about like some of the fun little like punch out things and stuff like that? Do they throw enough of that stuff in there to like?
No, and that's my biggest issue, is that whether it's a cool new mechanic that involves popping out and going back in the world, or a cool thing like the little punch out game, there's other little quirky things like the bow and arrow. I did enjoy the bow and arrow, as rudimentary as that minigame kind of is. There's just not enough of that, and it's not spread out throughout the game in a way that is appealing. And it's just, here's another cut scene right now, we're doing and just so slow. I just cannot like, I think you would still have a really good time with this game with your expectations lowered. But I went in with my expectations very high, and that's what's burned me, I think.
Yeah, I that's a super interesting point, and that has such an effect, I think, on our overall takes on games and opinions on them. Is what did we think going into them? What were the expectations going in? Because if they are astronomical and they aren't met, then it leads to a lot of distaste. Even though you might like this game more than another game.
Yeah, I think this will still be in my top 10. It might be.
Right.
I don't know if it'll be the bottom or the middle.
Sure.
It won't be at the top, but
which is hard to get across, because I think like we're very much talking about this game from a critical perspective at the moment, and have not said a great deal nice about it necessarily. But I think that's,
I need to say some nice things. Like I do think it lives up to what the trailer sells. It does do that, because all the criticisms I have are things that you would just assume a game of this style would have mechanically, because if the visuals look this good, then the swinging of the sword must also feel this good, and it
must feel snappy.
It must feel snappy. It must feel like this. If the visuals look this good, then the narrative must also fit this really cool world, and have these cool dungeons or bosses or Zelda.
And you almost expect it to be Pixar-esque, where it works on a level for kids and adults simultaneously. Yeah.
And it definitely leans so much more on the kids side than the adult side in terms of the Pixar comparison. And but yeah, I do think that it is kind of stunning. It does the whole big small thing where you pop out the book, and then there's areas where you're high up on this is where it really tanked my Steam Deck, but when you're high up on the desk and you can see into the garden, and like some of the visual effects are really, really impressive. But again, I'm talking about visuals. Like it just looks really pretty. The world is really cool. It just doesn't link strongly to a narrative. And yeah, I think I just need to. I'm now treating the remainder of this game, because I do want to see the end of this game, but I'm just going to play like half an hour every day and just cruise along, and my expectations are going to be lower. And when it does cool and interesting things mechanically, those are cool and interesting, but I just think I'm accepting that they're not going to come at the rate I want them. And when the answer to a puzzle is shouted in my face the second I get there, I just have to accept it. And I'll spend the 5 minutes moving around the area, doing the thing to complete the puzzle that I already know the answer to from the first 20 seconds, and I'll just take my medicine, and that's that. And that's fine, because I do think it is still an enjoyable game to play, and it's just not got the concentration of fun that I was hoping for.
I think it seems like it's very well crafted, but I think its priorities are they lie in a different place to where we would want them to be.
Definitely, yeah. And I am gradually turning into MBZ by the day. And this game is persuading me.
Look, it was a mistake to give Valley a Steam Deck. The PC gaming attitude is bearing its head. No, I definitely, it strikes me as this is a game made by people who have young kids and would like them to be able to enjoy the work that they make. And I think there's probably a lot of influence that comes in there, and that's totally cool. And I think that if you do have kids of an age of, I don't know, probably like 6, 7, feels like a perfect game for that kind of age group, and is super charming and colorful and all that sort of stuff. So I would like to definitely check it out and play it. And I worry. I think the thing that worries me the most is you saying like the sword swinging feels like sluggish, because that above all else is the thing that will turn me off a game like this. So
but I mean, but now you're expecting it.
Now I know
it might feel less sluggish than your new expectations.
Exactly.
So you're going in there knowing that, oh, this might feel sluggish. The story's sluggish. This is sluggish. There's not much fun. There's not this. But other than that, it's really,
Yeah. So. Other than all these caveats.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I think it is a shame. It says a lot about like where we are with games, and how hard it is to have a game be a success on all these different levels. Because I think Plucky Squire was like brilliantly marketed. I think Devolver did an exceptional job of getting people interested in the game and showing the cool aspects of it, and building it up as this thing of like, this is going to be a really, really big thing. But at the end of the day, I think this is just a thing with games, is if the game doesn't hit on a level for people that enjoy playing it, then it doesn't end up taking off in that way. I think games are so quality driven at this point in time because of how many options there are out there and how many different games you can play, and the saturation.
I'd say like especially indie games and stuff, like it's
definitely
arguably even more competitive market, and
incredibly competitive.
It's we're going to talk a lot about indie games in the email section.
Yes.
But interesting that this one just doesn't quite stick the high expectation, the big landing that it needed. But
because it feels like it would be a TNL pick. This is the kind of game that we look at.
Oh, definitely. This should be a very much a TNL game. This should be top 3. I predicted at the start of this month, like Astrobot, Zelda, and this game could potentially be my top 3 of the year, and that is definitely not the case.
Right.
But
how much do you think it is? Because you mentioned this at the top of like just coming straight off of Astrobot and going into another thing. It's never gonna do it favors, right? Going from one of your favorite things into something else. Do you think that has impacted your thoughts on this?
Especially when some of my criticisms of this game are kind of sluggish sword swinging versus Astra, which is one of the most crisp feeling games, just so visceral. It's so, like, what's the word I'm trying to explain?
It's just juicy, like polished,
so tactile.
Like tactile. Yeah,
really polished. And you can tell that the designers of Astrobot are designing that game in a way to make it interesting and Moorish, and what's around that corner, how does this work? And they're aiming it at someone that's obviously much older than 6-7 years old. As much as I think someone 6-7 years old might enjoy Astrobot a great deal, the Plucky Squire just doesn't feel like they like you said when you mentioned like they've come from a Pokemon background and how Pokemon has become easier and easier. That makes perfect sense with how this game feels pacing wise. I'm barely touching the sides. Like, I'm not dying. Here's one thing. Every time you take damage, the next enemy that you hit automatically drops hearts.
Wow.
Like, no matter what. Like,
okay.
And this constantly happens. And I'm playing on like the harder mode, whatever. There's 2 modes. There's like story and non-story, I guess. I can't remember. But I like in Zelda dungeons when I'm walking around with 1 heart and I might die and risk going back to the start of the dungeon. Like, that's just kind of...
It's a tension, right?
You get used to a bit of tension because it makes you play a game differently and focus more on it.
I guess a question on like the tech stuff, because I do think that's something that could turn off young audiences, is like, how wordy is it? Like, do you need to be reading all this to understand what to do?
I don't know, because there's the big cutscenes between chapters where the words are really big and it's proper story book. The words are there's so few words that, like, once Bally Jr. can read, he'd get it. Yeah, but then like the text boxes in the main game, so there's something like, my eyesight is fine, but I love to, whether it's laptops, handheld consoles or anything, I just like pumping up text as like big as was reasonable, because I like to just relax my eyes as much as possible and not have to like focus. And there's like no text editing options in this game at all for like size of text and text boxes and stuff. So it's not great in that sense, because I do the font is just a bit odd for like the main game and stuff like that. But yeah, sorry, your question was like, is there just too much reading?
Right, like would a 6-year-old be frustrated because they'd get to a bunch of text in a town and not be able to, like, have to be forced to read a bunch?
No, because it's simple enough.
Okay.
But then I don't know. I just find it's very plodding, just very slow, and
it's very interesting as well what you said about like Astrobot and like a kid playing it. So Patrick Klepek recently on his crossplay blog released a article. I'll link it to you after this, where he has videos of his daughters playing Astrobot with him, and they are very enjoyable to watch because it just gives you a sense.
They're like
of like
3 and 7-ish,
something like that. Yeah. And I think it's just really interesting because it shows like the curiosity and the wonder that game has, and obviously like it's very difficult for a kid of like 3 years old to control or do anything. But the way it's designed, the way that it's laid out, like the shyness of the coins, like the way it leads you, it's just very interesting, and it I think it says a lot about, you know, I've heard Jeff Grubb as well talk about how his kids are super into Astrobot, and like I think a lot of people are attracted to it, and I think part of that is like subliminally they're understanding like the game design of it, you know, even though it's not a thing they would think about. Like I think it's just so excellently executed that is part of the charm that is appealing to kids. And I think there is a risk of a game like this being so dumbed down that even kids will find it boring because it feels like it's talking down to people generally, you know.
Totally. And it's funny because Echoes of Wisdom is out very soon, and that sounds like it's the least handholdy 2D Zelda ever. It's like, here's a bunch of crazy ass mechanics, now go do your thing, and it's like, that's just so opposite to the design of this game, that it'll be quite a stark change when I play that later this week. Yeah,
absolutely.
But yeah,
cool.
Anyway, MZ, have you been playing something better?
Yes. So I have been playing a game. It's very interesting, right? Because I think Plucky Squire is one of those where I'm like, that's one I want to play. And UFO 50 I looked at and I'm like, that seems really cool. Am I really going to be into that? I don't know. We talk a lot about on the show how we don't really like NES games that much, you know? We look at the NES and we're...
That's what made... I saw this game, I'm like, why does anyone like this game? And then you were raving about it, like, why does MBZ like this game? Would I like this game?
Yeah. So let's set up what is UFO 50. So UFO 50, it's 50 video games in one. But it's not like one of those you go to like a dodgy supermarket and a guy selling you a stick, and it's one my dad bought one of these like when I was younger, and it's like just doesn't even work. You try and plug it in and half the games are like bad ROM hacks of Mario and like all that sort of stuff. Like it's nothing dodgy like that. So this is from Derek Yu, the creator of Spelunky, obviously a super successful roguelike. Spelunky and Spelunky 2. And he's working with a childhood friend of his, John Perry, I believe is his name. So they grew up together and made games when they were younger. And so they kind of came together, and they also brought on a few other game developers, one of which was the creator of Downwell, who used to work at Nintendo for a little bit and then left Nintendo and then made Poinpy, which I talked about earlier this year that I love. So he was part of it, a few other designers they brought on board. But basically the idea behind this concept is they essentially have created this mythos, this fake video game company, this fake video game developer who made a console called the UFO, and basically have chronicled an entire history of fake video games that this company made.
In like the 90s, 80s? Or
no, the 80s. From 80s. Like 1983 to 1989. So it doesn't even get to the 90s. It's only the 80s. And so the idea is that each of these games has like a little bit of a description of it, of like, this was made when they were still working at their jobs and they were doing it in their spare time. So the first game in the collection has that kind of thing, and then it's like, and this was the first game on the UFO to use side-scrolling techniques and parallax and stuff like that. So each little game is like a piece of technology of this history, as well as like different people worked on it design-wise, and like it feels like a meta-narrative of they made up this entire thing. But also, you know, each of these are fully functional, playable games. Now, when I say fully functional, playable games, they're all in the era of the NES. So they are not going to be like, there's not a game in here that's like Baldur's Gate 3. All of these games have a specific scope to them. And obviously the earlier ones are going to have a lower scope to some of the later ones. But there's a variety of genres: puzzle, strategy, racing, golf, like platformers. There's a Metroidvania in here, tactics stuff, and all of them feel so unique and interesting. And I was imagining, okay, it's going to be like, this is like our Mario, and this is like our Zelda, and that kind of thing, right? And it's not like that at all. It feels super innovative in the way that each of these games feels like it's taking a splash of modern ideas and design. It's almost like what would have happened if game designers back then had seen what the history of games was going to be, and they were taking a little...
But we're limited to the tech.
Right. So one of the games I want to call out that I started playing today, let me find its name actually. I've got my... so I've been playing it on Steam Deck. This is a game that I'm shocked is not on Switch, or it's not on console, because it feels like, it's made as a classic NES console essentially. And I think, the audience for this game is Nintendo fans, really, at the end of the day. So it is currently only on PC. I believe it will. I can see this popping up in an indie world in 6 months' time and being a shadow drop and being like, it's out today. It absolutely could be the case.
And are all these... Is the aim of the game this is just 50 games?
Yes.
Just play them. That you're not... It's not like some overarching thing that you're doing to link the games.
So it seems like, and Derek Yu and Spelunky, there's a lot of secrets in that game. It seems like there's probably some hidden shit in this game, I would imagine. Is
that for 30% of the players or 5% of the players?
Yeah,
or
I don't know.
1%?
I'm super interested. So there's a terminal you can bring up in the game, and it's basically like a code. You can input a code, and there's a bunch of stuff on the side, like messed up letters and things that look like gobbledygook, and it feels like there's something hidden with that. There's probably some codes you can find within the games that you input into the terminal and it unlocks something weird. And I don't know that this has an inscription level, like the layers keep getting peeled back type of thing to it, but I think there's probably something a bit more than's on the surface. Okay. For generally, if you want to jump in and play, you can play any of them at any point. You can.
Right.
I've been basically going chronologically from the beginning all the way through.
And are you trying to find secret stuff, or you're just there to experience a bit of each of the 50 games and have a good time?
Pretty much, yeah. That's kind of like the idea that I went in with. Going back to my point before about taking a little bit of modern inspiration, so a game called Paint Chase, and this game is you play as a car, and it's a top-down perspective, and it's basically like Splatoon but a racing game where you have this car and you're navigating around this top-down area, and other cars will spawn and they start putting red paint on the ground, and you'll be racing alongside them and being like, okay, I want to cover up your red paint with my blue paint. And you have a time limit, and eventually the timer runs out, and each level has a percentage of did you cover 70% of the screen.
Top down, did you say?
Yes, top down. Right. Super simple graphics. Cool. Very, very visually distinct and easy to look at. But I start playing this thing and I'm like, oh, this is fun. It obviously is very classic in terms of its look and its feel and everything, but it's just really enjoyable.
It's got a modern Splatoon mechanic.
Yeah, so it's taking some of those ideas, and it just feels a bit more creative than people would have been back in the day when it came to these older games. And what I found is, so I started with the first game. The first game I think you would hate initially, because I hated it as well. It's called Barbuta, right? And I was very worried, because the first thing you do is you walk to the right, and you step on a switch that you didn't realize, and it kills you immediately. I'm like, okay, well, we're playing real NES games here. It feels so old. It feels archaic in the way that a Spectrum game is, where there is no music, and the only noise you hear is when you land from a jump, there's a little sound effect that plays, and there's a sound effect when you slice your little sword. But it is very much like a Zelda 1 of let's explore this dungeon, and there's just a bunch of stuff going on. And so I started it, and I'm like, oh my god, this feels so sluggish and slow to move. It does the Castlevania thing where you can't adjust your jump. When you've committed to a jump, there's no mid-air movement, And I was like, oh, is this game gonna be for me? This first game is so archaic and difficult, and you have 6 lives, and if you die 6 times, you have to start from the very beginning again. And the game is basically a side-scrolling exploration game where you find items, and those items will eventually do different things, but it doesn't explain anything. It doesn't tell you anything about what any of these items do or what goes on. And what I found was I played it for 10 minutes and I was like, it's a bit old school and not really for me. I kept playing and I was like, okay, I'm kind of understanding a few things. Like, I figured out that if I got the umbrella item, then when I stood under these kind of dropping acid drops from the ceiling, I wouldn't take any damage. And previously, those had killed me. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. And then I got to a room, and the room had a character in it. And the character was like, make sure you look out for things that seem a little bit off. And so I exit that room, and I look at the room I'm in, and I notice something. And I'm like, oh, that's really cool. And so I notice this thing, I go to this area, and it leads to a secret, and I get another item, and I'm like, man, that was very satisfying. And so it's almost gone from this, like, archaic old NES thing that still, to be fair, feels very clunky and bad to control, to the point where I'm like, oh, but I'm looking at every screen now to see if there's something off or there's something I can interact with. And, like, I kept running into them, and I got to the point now, so from start to finish, if you played this all the way through and you knew exactly what you were doing, it probably takes 15 to 20 minutes. But I've played this game for an hour and a half now, just this first game. And I'm just like,
damn.
I'm really into just figuring out what's the route through this game. And when I die, I'm not that frustrated because I'm like, I learned something new that time. And, you know, I think, and that's the kind of been the experience I've had with every single one of these games so far, where I start out and I'm like, oh, this is a bit simple and whatever. And then you play a bit more and you're like, oh. So, like, there's a game called Magic Garden where it's basically Snake, but you're this girl, and you're this girl in a purple dress, and you're walking around this grid that looks like a chessboard, and you're collecting these pink slimes, and when you collect them, your body basically gets longer, like it becomes like a snake behind you. And to begin with, I was like, oh, what's going on here? And you run into, like, a different colored slime, and you die immediately, and it's game over. And then I'm just wandering around, I'm collecting the slimes, and I'm scoring 0 points. I'm like, I don't know what I have to do here. And I'm looking at the scoreboard, and it's like the lowest score on the scoreboard is 1,000. And I'm like, I'm not even getting like any points here. And then slowly I realize, you know, when you collect these guys, if you do this spin move over the top of these kind of basically there are lines of stars that appear on the board, like either in a line or in like a square. And if I do the little spin move while I have these guys behind me on one of those, I score a bunch of points. And the more guys I have behind me, the more points I score. And then I noticed, like, the more guys that I score, I then get access to this other power-up that lets me basically Pac-Man eat all the blue guys who I wasn't able to touch before without dying. And so slowly, but surely, I'm just sitting here playing this game, and over the course of an hour, I basically, like, learn everything about it without the game telling me anything at all, and it's so satisfying. It feels like I'm getting the experience of being a kid in the 80s, like, having no idea what an NES game is, and, like, figuring out how to play one of them, and learning its intricacies, and then learning, like, strats and tech about it, of, like, oh, but if I did this instead, then I could expand my points, like, way more. And essentially, a lot of these games, the early ones, are just high score chases, really, at the end of the day, and there's a real satisfaction in just starting off and getting, like, no points, and then by the end, you're like, oh, man, I could get 20,000 if I just had a really good run, if I just kind of, like, strung it all together. And, you know, it just feels like all these have different ideas. They're all really creative. Some of them feel, like I said, a little archaic to control, but they definitely have, like, a good modern vibe to them as well. So there is, like, I finished one of them today, so I actually got to the end of one of them, and when you finish it, you get a little gold cartridge around it, and so I saw that, and I'm like, oh no, this is bad, because it now means, like, now I want to get the gold thing on every single one of them. But I do know, having played, I've played 8 games so far, I think, out of 50, and Steam says I have, like, 6 hours in this game. So, I mean, there's a lot going on. Every game is so different. So there's a game that I played today called Mortal, which is a puzzle game where you basically have these guys and you use them as, like, platforming. So you're walking around this guy on a screen and you press X and he jumps into the wall, and then you spawn another guy, and this other guy can use that other guy as a platform to jump up, and then you can, like, use that second guy to turn into a stone, and that stone then becomes like a platform for the third guy, and, like, you're basically using all your characters as you go through to become platforming things to help you get through the level.
And is it a platformer or, like, a puzzle game, or kind of both?
It's kind of a combination of both. Obviously, you're platforming and jumping, but the puzzle is, okay, here's a bunch of spikes. What do? Oh, I'm going to turn into a stone block so that the next guy who I spawn can then jump on that stone block and get over the spikes. Oh, how do I get through this wall? I need to explode. So you can explode your guy, and it breaks the wall, and then the next guy who comes through can jump through the area. And the way that it works is you have a limited number of guys that you can use. So you start with 20 lives, essentially, 20 guys, and each one that you use, you then have to, take a number down off of your total. And so it's about efficiency. It's about how can I get through this using the least number of dudes so that the next level I have more to start with, essentially. And obviously there's a bit of a brutality to these. A lot of them don't have save systems. A lot of them, you restart from the beginning. But I think they're all designed in a way that makes sense and doesn't feel frustrating and doesn't feel annoying. And obviously, because there's 50 games in this collection, you can kind of just pick and choose what you want. You don't have to play all of these. And I wouldn't recommend dedicating yourself to beating one before moving on.
It's such a weird idea overall, just the idea of so collections are not an unusual idea, but collections for new games is just that aren't done in a WarioWare kind of way, actual whole games to be released like this is I'm surprised they didn't think, right, well, we've got 50 games, these 5 are so good that we should probably try and get them published separately. Or maybe they have done that and they're going to come out in the future, but it just feels strange to just say, right, 50 games together, go.
Yeah, it's such a wild creative idea, and I think part of it is that kind of meta narrative of well, this was a company who existed, even though it's basically just creating a fake narrative of a company that existed in the 80s who made video games and had a video game console, and these were the games that were released on it. And it even goes so far as to have sequels to games within the collection, so you'll play an early game and you can also play the sequel to it. If you wanted to, you could just jump straight to the sequel, but I think there's a real cool historical bent to this as well of, well, I played the first Mortal, but there's Mortal 2, and I wonder if there's some different nods or references in that one. Some games I'm sure will have characters who cross over and those types of things. I think there's a real benefit to playing all these games and seeing the connections between them, and then some of them you just get really into, right? Magic Garden, I played for an hour straight this afternoon because I was just I got to get a higher score. It was so satisfying. I was this game just has its hooks in me. There's one called Ninja Peck where you're a ninja and you're always moving forward, and so you're kind of trying to adjust as you move forward and you're throwing stars, and it has that kind of a little bit of fuck you design, but in a way that feels satisfying because you then memorize the level and you know where it's going to get you, and so you can get past those blocks. There's so much more in this mine for me to tap that I have not got to yet. And I've not touched any of the modern games. Like I said, I'm kind of going through it chronologically, just from a perspective of, I think that's probably the most fun way to do it. It's just see how things evolved as you go through the era. But there's a full JRPG in this, which is probably 10, 15 hours long, Jesus. It's mad. It's the amount of work and time and effort that's gone into this it took them 8 years to make, right? It's been a passion project for a very long time, but it's just so cool.
And you've not seen anything that suggests any meta-narrative or anything yet?
Not yet, and I haven't heard anyone talk about it yet.
Because I was going to make a really weird comparison, see what you think about this, and this is a very dark comparison. Immortality.
Oh,
because that is, what is it, 3 films?
Yes, yeah.
And they're more or less, and they're not full feature films, but they're pretty long films. And then it's about, the whole thing is about, you're not really enjoying the films in a traditional way because the meta narrative is almost the main narrative in a way because you're trying to work out what's piecing it together. It's not that comparable, but it's here's a collection of films, have at it kind of thing, and then you learn darker, deeper secrets. I'd be so impressed if there was some sort of deep, dark secret to this game. It might not be that dark, but I don't know, something cool that links it all together.
Well, yeah, you almost would want that, wouldn't you? Because each of these games has its own little description, and it's well, this was the first game designed by this person. They then went on to do this, right? And it's well, are we going to get a bit of narrative about who the people were who worked on these games and what happened, who left the company, who joined the company, were there strife? There's a lot that you could glean from it potentially, and whether that is this terminal thing that I have no idea about, or if there's some stuff within the games themselves. There's already, I think each game has a regular way to finish it, which gets you a gold cartridge, and then it has a cherry cartridge, a red cartridge, so you can basically do regular beating it, and then you do like a hardcore way of beating it. So from a completionist standpoint, oh my god, I mean, this game is like hundreds of hours of stuff to do, and you know, I feel like I'll probably put at least 50 to 60 into it before I see everything.
Okay.
Especially if it goes to the point of like, because this has been happening, like every new game I boot up, and it's kind of staggering, every new one I'm like, wow, this is really cool and creative, and then I get hooked into it and I just keep playing it. And maybe that changes later because I'm in the era of the more arcadey style high score chasing games. So I'm playing Magic Garden 25 times in a row because I want to get a higher score, you know, and I'm just like hooked into it. It's a really good podcast game for that, obviously. But it does have that kind of like all the music as well, right? All like, just think about the amount of art, animation, music that has to go into this, and even that point of like the slightly annoying repetitive music that you would expect from a game of this era, like they've nailed all that stuff. It even has like, you know, when you scroll a screen and there's that kind of like weird artifacting that happens in older games, like they deliberately built that in to this stuff. And yeah, like I said, it feels like, I'd say Barbuta is the one that is the most archaic that I've played in terms of control. The rest of them all feel, relatively speaking, modern, and like I don't have too many frustrations with them. And the frustrations I have is more like, you know, it's me not being good enough to do it. Like the game that I beat, Velgress, which is basically you are jumping up. It's essentially, it's like Contra if you just kept jumping up and up and up, and like platforms disappear underneath you and there are enemies flying at you. It's a little bit like Point P in a way, but you control this character and you have a gun, and you are essentially just like scaling floors to get to the top. That one, you have a double jump and it feels really forgiving in terms of the, you know, not falling onto the spikes and dying every time. Obviously that happens frequently because of the type of game that it is, but yeah, there's almost a little bit of forgiveness there in the controls that regular NES games wouldn't have done, you know? Like I look at regular NES games versus these, and these all feel just much more approachable, generally, I would say. So if that is a thing that is putting you off about this, I wouldn't be worried about that, because I think it has a lot of affordability for...
We are not big NES fans, and
no,
to be like, yeah, these
not.
games are great, very approachable, is a big step.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I'm having a fantastic time with it. I think it's so cool and just such a weird thing, and I'm sure that my favorite game I haven't found yet, you know, like there are so many.
Okay, have you played, I saw Jeff Gersman tweeting about it. Have you played Pilot Quest?
I have not, no.
Okay. He says he's hooked on Pilot Quest and they should make a full-on sequel to Pilot Quest.
Okay, well, yeah, I think there's so many in here that I'm trying to find, like, where is that in the timeline? It seems like it might be one of... it's number 44, so it's pretty late.
Okay.
It's from 1988, so it's a good, 6 years ahead of where I am right now.
Right.
But that character that's in Pilot Quest, that is, like, the main character when you open up the game, when you boot up the game.
Okay.
So... like, that's probably the mascot of the console, probably, and it's interesting because I wonder, like, does that character pop up earlier in a different game and then becomes, like, the mascot and all that sort of stuff, you know? I've heard a lot of people talk about Party House is apparently a really good one. Yeah, and, you know, there's sequels. There's, like, you know, his Campanella 3, you know? Like, there's a game with multiple sequels here, which is kind of crazy, so... I'm going to keep playing it. Like, I want to find a really cool shmup to get into. I want to play that big RPG. Like, I think there's pinball stuff in here. There's weird golf games where you play as the golf ball and stuff like that. Like, it's taking classic NES ideas of simple games and flipping them on their head. Like, I heard about this one called Bushido Ball, which is baseball, but you're a samurai. And so you're, like, slicing the baseballs as they come towards you. Like, just weird, fun, creative ideas that only come from the idea of looking at game designers as being the last few decades and then reapplying that back to the lens of we only had this limited color palette and we only had this limited mechanics. Every game is 2 buttons, right? Because it's all on one console, it can only be 2 buttons. And so you have to get creative with that and, you know, make sure that all games can run in that way. So, yeah, I fucking love it. I think it's so cool. One of the coolest things I played this year, for sure. And, like, yeah, like, I basically, I spent an hour and a half playing Barbuta, and I was like, oh no, oh, I'm fucked. Like I'm going to be playing so much of this for the foreseeable future. And it's one of those weird ones where I'm like, I don't know, how do I deal with this? Or like, how do you beat UFO 50? You don't, and that's not really how I'm going to treat it. I'm going to treat it of like, I want to experience all of these games, and some of them I'll go and finish, and some of them I won't. And yeah, and I think that's the nice thing about it is it is so broad and so wide in terms of its appeal that everyone's going to find their favorite, and everyone's going to find ones that really connect with them. So yeah, I cannot recommend it highly enough, and I guarantee you this will come to either Switch or the Successor system very soon. I think a lot of people will be very happy to see that because, you know, there's no technical limitations here. Like all these games will run perfectly fine on Switch because they're all old games at the end of the day. So great stuff. UFO 50. Cool. Check it out. All right, I've got two more things, but I'll be relatively quick. The final To the Moon game released is called Just a To the Moon series beach episode, which it's essentially a end cap on...
How many episodes are there?
I think just this one.
Okay.
So it's basically an end cap on the To the Moon trilogy, if you want to say that it's To the Moon, Finding Paradise, and Imposter Factory, the three games that kind of cover that general narrative.
It's the end of a trilogy, but it's the fourth thing.
Yeah, basically. It's like an end cap, basically. And, you know, there's multiple, there's mini-sodes that went up for free on Freebird's website. There was also a Bird Story, which was a small, similar in length to this, actually, like a couple of hours game that was a bridge narrative between To the Moon and Finding Paradise before Finding Paradise came out. So I realized that I believe I played To the Moon about 10 years ago at this point in time, because 2014 was around when I was starting to play stuff on PC, and To the Moon was one of the first games I played on my original PC. So it feels like the end of a very long journey in terms of the narrative that has been threaded through these games, and generally the way that these games, you know, the narrative works is To the Moon was mainly about that kind of story of that couple, right, and what happened with them and all that sort of stuff. But the meta narrative was that you have the scientists, right? The scientists are the people who help you, you know, change what your memories were before you pass away.
It's coming back to me a bit now.
Yes, so Neil and Eva are the two scientists, and so you play as them in every single one of these games, and each game is a different case of like trying to help someone, you know, before they die. These people get called in and they use their technology to go back through their memories, relive their life, and then kind of change things so that they feel more satisfied at the end of their life before they pass away. So this really does focus on those scientists. Finally, it doesn't have them like be involved in a wider narrative, and it is, you know, them going on holiday, on vacation, and, you know, they're just doing fun stuff, hanging out at the beach, talking to each other. But something feels a little off, you know? When you get there, you're like, oh, why are you here? Like, why is this character? This character shouldn't be here, and this character's also here. None of these people should be here. Why is this happening? What's going on? And there's, you know, as you go through, there's little glitches and things happening, and you're like, I think there's something weird happening here. And so, yes, there's obviously like a wider thing going on here. And in typical Kangao fashion, there's a lot of very emotional music and very good writing that always just like gets me to, you know, choke up. And I think it puts a very sad but very emotionally resonant end cap on this series. I think it's really well handled, well done. And it's only a couple of hours long, so basically as soon as it released yesterday, I downloaded it immediately and just sat there and played through the whole thing.
Were you aware of it coming, or was it like a surprise thing? Or
yeah, I was aware. I had it on my wish list for a while, but I didn't know about release date that much until like this previous week when I saw on Twitter that they were like, oh, it's coming soon. I was like, oh, nice. So I was immediately, you know, it's one of those series where I just buy it sight unseen. Like as soon as it comes out, I'm like, right, I'm there. I'm gonna play it immediately. And yeah, I think it's really, really nice. There's another thing in the To the Moon series that is coming called the final hour of an epic To the Moon RPG. The premise is that you're playing the final hour of a 70-hour JRPG with the To the Moon characters. So I don't know how that also will tie into this, but it feels like a slightly different project. The art style is totally different to anything they've done so far. So it feels like maybe something slightly
But the final hour of a Square Enix JRPG is often the least fun hour in the
sure.
whole 70 hours.
Yeah.
Why would you want to do that?
We'll see how they handle it. Maybe that means that they just give you overpowered characters, because they've already done all the grinding, so it's fine. But yeah, I'm very interested in that. But in terms of the actual like wider narrative for the To the Moon series, I think this is really just a final kind of like end cap on it, and I think it's really nice. It's really well handled, and I really enjoyed it. And there's a moment you're like exploring the beach, and you get this metal detector, and the metal detector is basically, I believe this was kickstarted, and so the metal detectors, you go around the beach, you just find messages from Kickstarter backers about the love of the series and what it's helped them with and like what it made them feel. And it's just very nice. You just walk around that beach just reading messages from people, just talking about how it's affected them, which is a very, very cool thing. So you could definitely spend multiple hours just walking around that beach, because it's probably a lot of Kickstarter backers. But yeah, I just kind of went through all the things, and there's a little mini game where you're doing a surfing kind of battle that is a different mechanic they throw in there. So there's fun stuff in there, and it's again, the writing is just impeccable, like really well done, and the music as well. The final theme is just it's a heart-wrenching piece of music. So yeah, I think I really enjoyed it. I was always going to enjoy it. Yes, absolutely. Oh yeah, it's all piano all day, every day.
That's what I remember the most about To the Moon is the piano and the.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
The melodies, they're beautiful. Really, really nice. So yeah, do I recommend this to people? Only if you've played every other game in the series and know exactly what's going on, because otherwise
you'll take too long, right?
No, not too long. I think every game is like maybe 7 hours each, 7 to 8 hours probably. And yeah, I think for me, Imposter Factory is still probably my favorite of all of them. I think that's the one that hit the hardest. But To the Moon's amazing. I'm a huge fan of that. And yeah, all 3 games are really, really good. So I recommend playing all of them. I believe most of them are on Switch now. I know To the Moon is on Switch. I can't remember if the sequels are or not, but hopefully this will get ported as well. And yeah, it's really good end cap if you're a fan of that series. So go check it out. The last thing, Valley, is I finished Emio The Smiling Man.
Nice. Satisfied?
Yeah. So yeah, I was talking a lot about some of my frustrations with Emio last time, and to be fair, at the end of the day, I think the thing that made the remakes frustrating was more the like, I don't know what the fuck to do. Like, I was wandering around constantly in the remakes and having to use a guide and being like, what do I press at this specific location, at a specific time? At the end of the day, like, even though it feels pointless just pressing all these options in Emio, you never get stuck. Like, you will always move forward. You'll always be able to know what to do. So that's good in that sense. And I was able to kind of get through it. Never had to go to a guide or anything. I just got through the game on its own terms, which was very, very good. The end of this game is wild. It's insane. I think there's a thing that happens that I've not seen in any Nintendo game or many games generally, and is extremely dark. And I don't know. I don't know if you care about ever playing this game, Bally. But I almost want to do a bit of a spoiler thing and say skip this if you don't want to hear it.
Here's the thing. This is the kind of game where I'm probably not going to get around to it, but I'd happily play it when you're like, oh, Game Trade's coming around and you need to play it. So I
don't know if I would give it to you.
If that's the case, then I think you can be spoiled. And the other thing is you're forgetting that my memory is a sieve. So
that's true.
If you tell me, I probably won't remember. So it's all good.
All right, well, okay. If you want to know nothing about the end of Emio The Smiling Man, then we've put timestamps in the description. You can go to the email segment and just not listen to it. That's fine. So this game, at the end of this game, you rock up at this house. You've been following this guy, and you're like, I think this guy's the killer. I think this is the person. And you rock up at this house, and the detective lady who you've been working with is already there, and you're like, oh, she knows some stuff that's going on, and clearly there's been some connection between her and this guy, and you get there, and a sequence plays out that's very harrowing, just gunshots and bad stuff. It ends up with like him almost killing her, but then he gets attacked by the guy who's gone missing, who turned out to be the detective's brother, and he's like, when you look at his face is just fully disfigured, like awful, horrible, disgusting, and he's kind of murdered on the floor. And then the game ends, and you're like, wait, I don't understand what the fuck happened. What was going on there? And so after the credits, you go back to the home screen, and the detective is like, "Hey, I could tell you what's going on with this guy's backstory and what the fuck happened, but it's really dark. You probably don't want. It's like basically a content warning.
Oh, wow.
Being like, you don't have to see this if you don't want to."
So do people go, "Oh, I don't want to see this," and then finish the game, but don't have any satisfaction, or?
I guess some people might want to do that. So yes, but I was like, I don't know what the fuck's going on here. I need to find out what's happening. And so you basically. The final part of this game is you playing as the kind of the main detective, who is your boss essentially, and the whole game he's been missing because he's been on his own adventure figuring stuff out, and you basically see what he figured out. He goes to the town where this murderer grew up and all that sort of stuff, and learned about his backstory, and basically it's a very tragic backstory. Him and his sister had a very abusive father who was horrible and awful to them. There's a whole situation where basically he is abused by his father, and then him and his sister are trying to leave, and the father finds out and like throws all their shit in the river, and his sister tries to go in the river and save their stuff, and she drowns. And so he basically feels his guilt because his sister has died because of this thing, and then he basically loses his entire mind, basically is orphaned, goes and like lives in like the woods and stuff for a while, comes across this couple, and like they kind of like ingratiate themselves to him, but he's basically just this broken guy. And he basically, what happens, the entirety of this story and the way he starts killing people is explained in I kid you not, 30-minute anime episode. The end of this game, it turns from the visual novel style into an entire anime episode that is like beautifully animated, like really high production value. And you just sit there and you just basically watch an entire anime play out of this guy as he slowly loses himself and like murders these women, and it basically like hates himself, starts taking these, there's a sequence where he takes these giant shears and he disfigures his face. He basically starts slicing his face to make his face basically a giant permanent Joker smile, and like cuts off all of his flesh. And it is, I mean, they don't show all of it, but it is just like you can hear the sound effects and all of it happening, and it's just fucking horrifying. Like it is awful stuff. Yeah, so it goes to some dark places, and is very it's very hard to watch at sometimes. But I think it does a good job of like, I don't know, showing what was led to and how this trauma caused all this stuff. And
okay, right.
Yeah, it's pretty rough. So, but yeah, I was blown away by the fact that I'm like, is this cutscene? I thought it was going to be like a 2-minute little cutscene to show something, and then it kept going, and it just kept going. I'm like, I'm just watching an anime now for the rest of this. They were like, fuck it, we're not going to explain it, we're just going to make a whole fucking anime. And I was like, that's crazy, the budget to do that. And like, obviously this game looks very good, so there was a good amount of budget put into it, but I was like, what the fuck is happening? Suddenly this visual novel is now an actual TV show. And yeah, that was just kind of crazy. So yeah, it's the darkest thing in a Nintendo game I've ever seen. It's fucked up. And I see why it was 18 rated, because there's a lot of horrible stuff happening in that game. So
wow.
Anyway, there you go.
Nintendo went for it all and did it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's Sakamoto, right? And he's obviously he's been there for a very long time, but clearly had some pent up emotions he wanted to get out. So, in his story writing. So, yep, that's Emio The Smiling Man. So hey, let's put some nice music here so you forget all about that. We'll be back after the break with some emails. See you in a bit.
I don't know what's real, if an ending's ever good enough. Maybe it never is. Maybe it never was. Maybe it never could be. Something more than just a city light in an endless ocean of skies. Stay with us till we're gone.
How many more decades
just an echo when we're gone.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the second part of today's show. Time for emails. If you would like to send an email into the show, please email ThisNintendoLife@gmail.com. That is ThisNintendoLife@gmail.com. We also have a Discord server. We have a channel on that server called Emails. You can post your question there, join the community. It's all good fun. But this time, Declan from Montreal emailed, and this is going to be our one question for this email segment because this is quite an important question. So Declan says, I remember first watching Indie Game the movie over 10 years ago around its release. It played a big part in getting me into indie games. Something that always stuck with me about the games that were highlighted is that they set a cultural touchstone for what the idea of indie games were like. That is to say, I would often compare all indie games to Braid, Super Meat Boy, Fez, or even Cave Story and Spelunky. In my mind, those old school indies represented a sort of canon list of indie games. That was a long time ago, and honestly, even back then, the scope of this list was even too narrow. My question for you is, if you had to come up with an indie game cultural canon, which games would you choose? Which set of games do you think casts a wide enough range to encompass what people think of indie games, while also being great and well-known games themselves? I suppose another way to think about it is to build a Mount Rushmore of indie games. Thanks.
Yeah. Now, the thing about Mount Rushmore questions is
There's multiple ways of tackling it.
Yeah, there's multiple ways of tackling it. It's also extremely difficult because it means you have to choose 4, right? And 4 is a hard number to boil down. Like, what are the indie games of today? I think it's an interesting kind of set of games that is mentioned in the email, right? And you probably look at those now and you're like, that's kind of like the previous generation almost. Like, it's the kind of the original type of games you would think of when you think of what is an indie. And things, obviously, the definition of what an independent game is has expanded dramatically, and the scope and scale and size of these games and the sheer number of them that are coming out every single year and every single day is just massive.
Right.
So I guess it's a question of how we want to tackle it, Bally.
I heard kind of funny talk about this, and they were like, but what is Mount Rushmore?
Oh my God.
So the 4 presidents of Mount Rushmore, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln, represent 4 things about the United States. They represent the birth, growth, development, and preservation of the United States.
Yeah.
Do we want to find 4 indie games that represent the birth, growth, development, and preservation of indie games?
I don't think so, because I think the phrasing of this question, the birth wouldn't make sense, because the birth would by necessity have to include some of those older games, or one of those older games, right? Which I think is not really what the question is asking. It's more of a, okay, what are the 4 games to represent what an indie is in today's market, right? In the current era.
I think a modern slant is important. You're right.
Probably, yes. I think so. I think also probably important is like variety in terms of type of game, type of experience, what its focus is, what its like bent is, what its influence is as well, right? I think you got to have stuff that is widely known and recognized, super influential, innovative, but also each of them has to be distinct, I think, from a genre perspective.
And they have to be indies. I think the spirit of indie, in my mind, generally, and this is debatable, implies like small team.
Sure, yes. For the most part. And I think
for the most part,
there's
the ones I have an idea for are all small teams.
Okay. So yeah, I guess it's a question of where do we start? Like, what is the most obvious pick, and then how do you maybe build around that? Is maybe what I'm thinking. And there's lots of obvious like starting picks that you could do. I mean, for me, one that hits a lot of notes, and is obviously the one I'm going to go to first, is Hades. And the reason for Hades is a few different things. One, it's the rise of roguelikes. It's how prevalent that genre has become, how important that genre has become generally speaking, across the industry. I think it is also represents like a good ethos about the games industry, which is if you have a team who sticks together for many years and makes lots of stuff together, you retain that knowledge, you retain that level of quality,
and your games get better and better and better.
Exactly. And like we see with all these layoffs and all that stuff in the AAA space, how it ruins the ability to create amazing games because the knowledge is lost, right? The teams that worked together that made those great games in the past, they don't exist anymore, and so you can't build on that to make other great stuff. And so Supergiant, I think, is a great example of obviously a team who has worked together for years and years, has stayed small, has stayed nimble, and has just made better
like
and better games.
25 people-ish?
Something like that, yeah. They're super small, and they were able to do that because of it. I think the other side of this is, you could argue, I mean, narrative is definitely a key component for Hades as well, and like the way that narrative evolves with it and ties into it from a gameplay perspective. And I think also like it represents almost a breaking through to the mainstream as well. It's a hit that was very successful commercially and hit an audience that I don't think most independent games are managed or able to hit, basically.
It could also represent early access, then 1.0,
Yes.
which is quite an important factor
Very
in the
true.
indie scene.
Yeah, for sure. I think it definitely is. It hits a lot of different marks and a lot of different levels, and I think beside it being one of my personal favorites, I think it fits a Mount Rushmore really well.
Yeah.
Also, like the idea of just Zagreus' head on the mountain, I think just fits very nicely, you know.
Okay.
Aesthetically pleasing. So there you go.
I think that can definitely be in the 4 for now.
Yeah,
for sure.
I think it definitely.
Can I pitch
fits
one?
there. Sure.
So I think you need a game that represents the solo endeavor.
Okay. Yes. The one person in a basement.
The one person in the basement. And I think that it, like Indie Game the movie spoke to this a lot. It was a lot about like very small teams working on games, one person in the basement for a very long time.
Yeah.
But this game broke through in a way that I think is unique for one person games, and then stands to this day as the standard bearer in its genre that has led to so many other games of that genre, and that game is obviously Stardew Valley and Eric Perone. I think that I can't think of another more mainstream solo game that had the same level of impact, and it's just become a huge, and obviously it's a huge commercial success, but I think that culturally it's just a hugely important game for a bunch of different reasons to Hades, which I think is also important.
I think it also represents this idea of there were styles of games that used to be made by big companies, right? There were types of games that big companies used to have as a output on their consoles, and as time went on and those big companies evolved and things changed and players' tastes change, those games got left behind and they weren't really at the forefront anymore. And so farming simulators, those types of games, Harvest Moon, was a big deal back in the GameCube era, and then after that generation it feels like they kind of disappeared from mainstream games. And so it's a representation of a type of game that isn't being made by the big boys, and so an independent voice comes in and brings it back, essentially. It's like, hey, I liked these and a lot of other people liked them, so we should do this again, essentially. And it's like re-platforming the farming sim as an important thing within the game space, and obviously as a result it's led to a lot more people making their own farming sim games, and then it's almost like it's a snake eating its own tail. We're now back to the point of like, oh well, Disney's basically made one with Dreamlight Valley now, so it's bringing a thing that used to exist back, and now making it mainstream again and even more popular than it probably was in the past, right? I think there's a point to be made also that like the super casual audience like subsumed the farming style game with Farmville on Facebook and all that stuff back in the day, and it could kind of gone down a bad path, and then this game comes through and is like, oh no, you can make a real good game that uses these mechanics and in a much more ethical, better way. And I think it's also representative of a game that you can't put down. I think one thing that I liked about Hades was I could put it down. Like every day I played it after work. I did one run after work and I put it down. Stardew Valley, I remember the first time I played it, I forgot to eat dinner because I couldn't put it down because the loop was so incredibly strong because it incentivizes you to keep playing because of that like carrot on the stick of, oh, but tomorrow I can do this and the next day I can do that, and that kind of like customization as well, like player customization and doing what you want, I think is quite strong with this game.
Yeah.
So those are two big heavy hitters.
I think it's a bit harder after this. I think I've got
Yes.
another few suggestions, of course, but
Okay.
Well, I suggested Stardew, so you go next with one we can discuss.
Man.
Because those two do seem like locks. I don't know.
Yeah, I think those are locks, definitely.
Yeah.
I almost want to say a game that I haven't played, but I think is very different to those two, and that's Outer Wilds. I think Outer Wilds represents a kind of like love for discovery and secrets and mystery.
You can cover the narrative side of things quite well as well.
A little bit, but it's a different type of narrative, right? I think Fez would have taken this spot if we were talking about older indie games. And obviously we're bigger fans of Tunic, but I think Outer Wilds is...
Yeah, but we're trying to be more industry...
Yeah, if we're talking about the Mount Rushmore, right, of what people
Outer Wilds
think,
was more impactful than Tunic on...
I think so, yeah. And I think, right, the reasons for Outer Wilds is its wonder in terms of exploration and discovery. It's like reluctance to tell you anything, right? It doesn't tell you or really instruct you in any way, and that can chafe some people, definitely, but I think it's more about trusting the player. If we talked about Plucky Squire earlier in this episode, how it doesn't trust the player, Outer Wilds is one of those types of experience that is like, no, you'll figure it out. Just spend enough time with it, look at the problem enough, and you'll come to a revelation. You'll come to this meaningful thing that will blow your mind, and you'll be like, oh my goodness, I'm looking at this the totally different way, and it is completely opened up how I view everything about this world and how it works and what's going on. I think like the scale of it is bigger than something like a Hades or a Stardew from like I think it represents the ability for small teams to make big 3D games, right? Things that aren't just pixel art, things that aren't just,
That's an important point of modern indies as well that wasn't the case even 10 years ago, arguably.
Absolutely, yes. Like, we are in an era now where independent games can be big 3D things that are visually impressive and stunning and like breathtaking from like a aesthetic perspective, and and all the physics, all the kind of space travel, and the way that the entire world is like clockwork and just is in synergy with each other. And yeah, just I think it is that player-driven discovery. It's that sense of the unknown, and coming to revelations, right? Coming to things that initially you have no idea about, but after repeated kind of going through this loop again and again, you eventually figure it out. And I would say this is different to the roguelike angle that Hades has, because this is the thing that you're retaining is knowledge. And so, it's that everyone's trying to be like, what do we call this genre? Basically, the genre of Outer Wilds and Tunic and Fez and all these types of games, and everyone's like Metroidvania. Like it's not a very good term. Like the thing about like Animal Well and Outer Wilds and these types of games is they revel in not telling you anything, but still having so many secrets hidden and things for you to discover and find out. They are really like knowledge focused games, and games that you as a player, you don't gain anything progression wise, but your brain gains knowledge, and that is the key to unlocking what you need to do, essentially. Which I think is very cool. So yeah, that's my pitch for that one. I think it's a solid one, solid choice. Yeah.
So I'm gonna say a couple that I think you can probably have either or, but they represent similar spaces.
Okay.
See what you think. But I don't think I like one of these games a lot more than the other. I don't think we've really done much of the other one. But I think we need a game that represents online multiplayer and like interactivity and the two games I'm thinking of are either Among Us
Yeah.
or Rocket League.
Ooh, interesting.
And I think they're both multiplayer in very different ways. I think Among Us, kind of from a number of downloads perspective, probably made a bigger impact. But Rocket League was still a big deal, and it grew and grew and grew. Equally, we don't have to have something that represents multiplayer. I'm not saying,
but I think it's a good angle actually, like
Yeah.
the kind of social angle, right? Like, I
Yeah.
think like there's an argument to be made for like social games that big companies don't engage with, and I think Among Us makes sense for that reason, because it is like, it's a social deduction game, and this type of game has existed in like offline spaces for a long time. You know, people playing Werewolf and all those sorts of things, and board games and all those types of areas, but a digital version, or one that a lot of people wanted to play, wasn't a thing until Among Us, right? It kind of didn't invent anything necessarily, but it brought that idea to a mainstream audience, and obviously was massively, wildly successful. So I could definitely see that being an option. I'm trying to think of like, are there other multiplayer games or games that have that social connectivity to them that would make a good fourth one here?
I mean, it's not indie anymore, but like Minecraft, I guess
Yeah,
that's disqualified.
I think
probably.
I think it's a question of like how old that is as well, but it's a weird thing, because I think Minecraft and games of that ilk, we live in an era now where like games live forever, and so Minecraft is still as relevant today as it was when it first came out, and the same is the case with Stardew. Obviously Stardew came out much more later, but they are still really relevant. So yes,
I mean, I
probably
disqualify
still
Minecraft because of its ownership.
It's owned by
personally.
Microsoft, and I don't think, I think it's kind of gone beyond that, right? As soon as that happened, I think it ceased to be independent,
Right.
even though it started that way. It's a weird case where it's one of the biggest games in the world ever made, right? So it's slightly different. I think the nice thing about Among Us, if we did want to go that direction, is also like Inner Sloth as a company, and what they represent,
That's a
and
good
what
shout.
they are doing now with Outer Sloth and funding smaller games, in the face of an industry that doesn't want to help anybody or put funding in, and it's drying up and it's a nightmare. I think that's more of a meta reason potentially why you would do that. I think also like there's a spirit of collaboration with Among Us, in terms of like the indie game crossover, which, you could argue that Shovel Knight would be a good representative in that case, of like, we live in an era of crossovers and worlds mashing together and collaborations, but I feel like that started with indie games when it comes to the game space, because it's so much easier to say to your friend like, oh hey, you're making a cool game, do you want to put Shovel Knight in that game? And they're like, yeah, sure, and that's it, and you don't have to go through legals or anything. It's like, yeah, well, let's do this cool thing. And so a game like Among Us has had a lot of that stuff, in terms of they just did a Critical Role crossover. Obviously, we did a collaboration with Balatro with Among Us. Like, it's a spirit of collaboration that independent games have that I think is very nice, and I think is another thing you could probably throw in its favor if we did want to put it on the list. So yeah, I don't know. I'm almost arguing myself into doing that, but I feel like there are so many options, right? And it's very difficult to nail it down. But I think we do have some good kind of reasons for each of these, and distinguishing categories as to why they would be in that mold.
Is there anything else? There's some other games I'd want to throw into the ring, but
I think Vampire Survivors and Among Us have some kind of interesting synergy with each other. I think Vampire Survivors it kind of crosses over to Stardew of like single person developer, but I think one of the things that Vampire Survivors represents is the out of nowhere success that can happen with indies these days, where it was just a thing that a guy threw up on Steam, and it had no followers, no one knew what it was, and it just blew up out of nowhere.
It's not got the visual polish.
Yes.
And they're really cool, and it can still be as successful as some of these most successful indies.
Right, exactly. Like, Vampire Survivors is like, hey, this uses like some Castlevania assets, and like it's at its core, it's a really strong dopamine rich, like so impeccably designed game, but like it was, oh, okay, I'm just gonna put this thing up on Steam and a few people might like it, and that's really cool, but then it caught the imagination of people. Vampire Survivors won the BAFTA for best game that year.
Right.
Yeah, I think it beat Elden Ring for best game, which is incredible, and I think it says so much about video games that there is a visceral, simple, I think that represents that as well, right? Is that like it is the purest video game that exists, which is just number go up, thing happen on screen, number go up.
Yeah.
And it is, but it's done to such a level of execution and satisfaction that you just get entranced by it. It just fully puts you under its spell. So I would say that, like, if we're talking about what is the spirit of indie, what is like the smallest thing possible, I think that's a really good example of, I'm just a guy who put a thing out there and like I thought it was cool, and then suddenly everybody was just all over it. And I think like it breaks barriers, right? It's like this game has sold millions and millions of copies, and kids who are like 4 years old and didn't grow up with pixel art are having a great time with it, and adults who have played video games their whole life are having a good time with it. It's so accessible and just reaches across all barriers. So yeah, that's another one I would maybe throw in the ring for recent successes.
I'm going to suggest a trilogy that are all doing similar things.
Okay.
And they'd be Hollow Knight, Celeste, and Cuphead.
Right.
So I kind of think Hollow Knight arguably stands out in terms of impact versus the other two. I think that its like reason to be here would be, it's an incredibly high quality Metroidvania and it does stuff for that genre that, while we don't personally find is the most enjoyable aspect of the genre, is still it's like turning the Metroidvania into like a Souls-like, and was one of the first games to do that, arguably.
Yeah, for sure.
But then I think its impact and obviously the hype around its sequel, like it's got this weird, unique following that feels just so gargantuan compared to almost every other indie.
Yeah, almost like the meta narrative of Hollow Knight is more important than the game itself, you know, in a weird way, where it's like a cult-like status.
I think cult status would be its reason for being on. Yes. So,
which I think is interesting, because I think you could apply that to like bigger games as well, Half-Life 3 and other things that have been around for years that people wanted and didn't come out.
And if you're going cult-like, maybe Undertale is a better representative anyway.
Oh gosh, I didn't even think about Undertale. I mean, that's another whole can of worms you could open up, just about fandom and about like just how much people can throw themselves into a game's community and just drive it. Like, I think one of the things that people were frustrated with about Undertale in its initial kind of explosion was people hated Undertale fans because they wouldn't shut the fuck up, basically. You know? Like, there was such a fervent, like, thing that game engendered within people that they just became lunatics about it, you know? Like, there is
that's definitely up there with like the Hollow Knight fans now, I guess.
I think honestly they are more unhinged than Hollow Knight fans.
Okay.
I think Undertale. Okay, so there's a video essay that you should watch called I think How the Internet Ruined Undertale or something like that. It's from Super Eye Patch Wolf, who is one of the best video essayists out there today. I watch all this stuff. Very, very good. He's that good that I watched an entire video about wrestling, which I have little to no interest in. But it's excellent video. He's very, very good. And the depths that he goes to explaining about how there are fandoms of Undertale, like specific like offshoot fandoms of Undertale that have like bigger subreddits than most other video games or most other things. Like the length and the depth of that fandom is unbelievable. Like it is absolutely crazy. And so if you want to have that aspect represented, then I don't think there is a better option than Undertale. I think that's it with a bullet. Like, I think it beats Hollow Knight on that stuff easily, which is kind of crazy to say because I don't think it's as present within our kind of sphere, but it is massive, like gargantuan, the level of following that Undertale stuff has online.
Okay. I think we've got all our nominees then. I think
Probably,
we don't really
yeah.
need to talk Celeste and Cuphead. I think they maybe
No,
fall
I think
by the
like
wayside.
they're games that we love and
Yeah.
are exceptional games within their genre spaces. But I think as a wider Mount Rushmore, I think it's
Yeah.
harder to fit them in necessarily.
I still feel quite strongly that Hades and Stardew are locks.
I think so, yeah, as well. I
I
think
think
they're definitely
it's
the locks.
these other 4-ish games, 5-ish games. I think
Yeah, it's
much
basically what you
harder.
want to represent. Is
So
it like
do we want to represent one person can put out something that is visually
up.
imperfect but mechanically perfect, like Vampire
Yes.
Survivors,
right?
versus the looping narrative nature of Outer Wilds, and
Yeah,
and then
discovery is player just
discovery,
like exploration.
and then the interactivity multiplayer of
Among Us, yeah,
Among Us, Rocket League,
or the fandom of
or the fandom
Undertale.
of Undertale.
Yeah, gosh, it's really really tricky. I think I do like the indie spirit of Vampire Survivors, but it is quite adjacent to Stardew Valley in that way.
Yeah, okay.
So I wonder if it's a little duplicative if we do that.
No, I see that. It's also
so-
another roguelike.
Yes, true. Yeah, and we probably want to be a bit broader in terms of types of games.
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
I
I
think
like
Among Us or Rocket League should be here.
Yeah. I think Among Us is the one that
Sounds
makes
like
the
you're
most
leaning more
sense.
Among Us. Yeah.
Generally, just with, like I said, the collaboration stuff, the wider way in which they're helping the games community, the spirit. I think the spirit of indie
yeah.
in terms of
I mean, Rocket League's like a AAA game now, anyway, isn't it?
sure, yeah, exactly. It's owned by Epic, so like I think the spirit of like
okay.
collaboration,
Well, yeah. It should be disqualified, I guess.
totally, and like helping the community essentially, like being a lightning rod for. Let's have all these cool things that we do with people, and like I think Among Us is really interesting from a wider lens of like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez played Among Us on live stream. Like there's a
Right.
political angle to Among Us, right? There's like a way in which it brought a lot of people together, and like I think Among Us is like the reason. I think Among Us is a great candidate because of Twitch streaming. I think streaming and the way in which indies
A very
can
modern phenomenon versus
exactly
Indie
yes.
game the movie, sorry.
Totally, right? Like successive indie games can hinge so much on streaming, and Among Us is a story of a game that came out, failed, nobody played it, it sat there for an entire year, and then someone picked it up on a stream, and all of a sudden every streamer is playing it, and so many streamers are blowing up because of it, and like it becomes this this beautiful like synchronicity where the game is making the streamers bigger, but the streamers are also making the game bigger, and it's like everybody is benefiting together, and like that is a beautiful story, and I think it made the careers of a lot of people, but also like as a game it was so built for the world of streaming because it's like 10 people at a time, and you can cross collaborate as streamers to play it together, which is also that spirit of collaboration. Yeah, the more I talk about it, I think it has to be on the list.
Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense with so many aspects of the industry.
So I think that makes it a straight shoot between Outer Wilds and Undertale.
Yeah, and I guess it depends on what you want to represent more. I think the Undertale stuff is really fucking crazy. I think there are also aspects of fandom that you can draw from Hades, which is potentially why there's a bit more crossover there, because part of Hades' appeal is its character art and how people got so thirsty for those characters and then drew a bunch of fan art about them and probably a bunch of fan fiction and went down that rabbit hole. And to be fair, nowhere near the scale of what Undertale has. But if we're talking about representing like that side of games of like communities, maybe it's slightly duplicative with Hades.
I think
but yeah,
I do like that Outer Wilds represents modern indies can have like multiple planets and it's just like an open universe you can fly around, and that's just a standard thing modern indies can have.
The 3D angle of it, like the scale and scope of the angle. Yeah, definitely.
It's an incredibly impressive scope. Are we leaning towards those four then?
Yeah.
If Hades is representing a little bit of the fandom aspect.
The fandom aspect, yeah. I think that probably eliminates Undertale, much as Undertale is like incredibly important. Yeah, I think that does make sense. So I'd probably do that, which means that our 4 would be Hades, Stardew Valley, Among Us, and Outer Wilds. Which sounds pretty good, I think. Like we kind of chatted through it, and I think it was good to kind of chat through all those elements. I think all of them bring something slightly different, and there's not a lot of crossover between them in terms of what the audiences they're covering or the things that they're doing that are impressive and different and interesting. Which I think is probably what I would seek in a Mount Rushmore, and I guess kind of what the question is asking, because you don't want to have any of them be. Because, when I think of like, oh, what are the best indies, I think a lot of my taste leans in a certain direction. I've never played Outer Wilds. I probably never will because of the motion sickness stuff for me. And like, I played Among Us a tiny bit once, but it's not really my taste. But I think when we're thinking about like the wider impact that these have and what they represent, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, exactly.
So
I'm happy with that. The thing is, and obviously we love Hades and Stardew Valley, so that also helps.
Of course.
But, we also appreciate their wider impact on indie games and the industry, so I think that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there you go. That's our Mount Rushmore of independent games. Let us know if you have any different takes. I'd love to hear some arguments for some other stuff that we've maybe overlooked or forgotten. Write into us. They can write into an email address, Bally. Where can they send those?
Yes, please email thisnintendolife@gmail.com. That is thisnintendolife@gmail.com.
Lovely stuff. That is going to do us for today's show. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening. We are going to talk about some stuff, and then we're going to get on out of here. So, obviously, you can get some extra stuff from us if you go over to patreon.com/thisnintendolife and support the show, and you can get benefits like extra episodes. And, Bally, we would like to thank some of our supporters.
Yes, thank you to our $10 tier plus patrons. They are Zach S, Thomas, Matthew, Albert, Wicked Gamer, UK Alan, Turtle, Orange Thunder, and Ali T. Thank you all for your support, but thank you also to all of our patrons. We really, really appreciate the support you give the show. If you want to catch what we've been putting out on our Patreon feed, we just last week did a long discussion about a game we both love very much, which we have just played, in Astro Bot. So definitely check out that discussion for $1 if you're interested. That's our latest episode of This Nintendo Life, so go and check that out.
Absolutely. So go to patreon.com/thisnintendolife and find a tier that's right for you. You can obviously find us in various places on the internet, such as on social media. I am at Lord NBZ in various places. Bally, where can they find you?
I am at Ballyman91. That's BALLYMAN91, and I'm on Twitter, but also Blue Sky, and I am looking forward to the day that I can actually give up Twitter and just be on Blue Sky, and I think we are getting closer to that day.
We've been saying that for like a year,
Yeah,
one day. You can find the show in various places. We're on Spotify, we're on Stitcher. You can download us by going to any podcasting app of your choice and typing in This Nintendo Life. And then what you can do, you can hit that subscribe button. It will come to you every couple of weeks. You don't have to even worry about it, don't even think about it. Auto download on your phone. It's great. It's amazing technology. The things we can do. Incredible stuff. You can obviously also go and review us, rate us on various platforms of your choice. That would be nice. I'd like that a lot. And you can also tell somebody, hey, I like this podcast, you should listen to it. That's a nice thing to do as well. So feel free to do that. That very much helps. I think that is it. I think I'll do us for this episode.
There's a Zelda game coming out. Can you believe it?
Oh, shit. It is very interesting, isn't it?
We're going to be talking about Zelda next show.
Fuck, I didn't even think about that. This podcast started with a brand new 2D Zelda game. Over 10 years ago.
The last one?
The last
new one,
last
with Link Between
original
Worlds?
2D Zelda, which I believe we discussed in episode 3 of this show.
Yeah.
Or maybe episode 2, I want to say.
November 2013.
November 2013. Yeah. So 11 years later, we're getting the first original 2D Zelda in, over a decade, which is pretty mad when you think about it.
Some people don't count Link Between Worlds because it reuses like World of Links, A Link to the Past.
Yes.
If you want to be strict. We're going back to Minish Cap in 2003.
Although Echoes of Wisdom supposedly reuses that as well, from what people are saying to some degree. No, Echoes of Wisdom seemingly
Echoes of Wisdom, okay.
is reusing some stuff as well.
Interesting.
But maybe it's just like a general, it's Hyrule, but it will look totally different.
Yeah,
so who knows?
okay.
But yeah, I'm very excited for this. Both of us have kept relatively away from all the deluge of stuff Nintendo is releasing about it, because they seem to be doing a lot of marketing to be like, hey, look at this and look at that. And I'm like, I just want to jump in and see the weird stuff this game has.
Spending all our remaining Switch 1 marketing budget on this game before
pretty much
we announce Switch 2.
Yeah, honestly, that makes a lot of sense, right?
There we go.
But hey, it's great to have a brand new Zelda game the year after a brand new Zelda game, right? Like, it's very nice.
I would not have predicted that.
No, certainly not. So we will be playing a lot of that, and I'm sure...
And it has been confirmed it's Grezzo working on the game, right?
It has, yes, which Nintendo continuing to do their weird thing of not telling us what studios are making their games. Great, thanks, guys. So yeah, I'm super excited for it. I'm sure we'll be diving in and discussing our thoughts next time, and yeah, it'll be good. It'll be good. I'm looking forward to it. So. Great. Well, that's going to do us. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks' time with another one of these shows where we talk about video games, Nintendo, and many other things. Till then, thanks for listening, and goodbye. The musical interlude used on today's show was World in a Memory from Just a To The Moon series beach episode, copyright Freebird Games 2024.